Hello and welcome to this special episode of the Photographic Life podcast, in which I read extracts from my book, published in 2024, Inside Vogue House, 1 building, 7 magazines, 60 years of stories. I think we all enjoy reading at least one book over the summer, so I hope you also enjoy listening to this one over the coming month. I wrote the book to mark the end of one iconic building in London being the home for some of the most culturally important magazines of the past 60 years, but also to share inside stories relating to the photographers and writers who helped shape those magazines. Vogue House was not only home to Vogue, Tatler, GQ, House and Gardens, Brides and Worlds of Interiors, it also had its own photo studios and was therefore a photographic centre for some of the greatest names in editorial photography. So please, get yourself a drink, sit back and enjoy some tales of a bygone era. Chapter 4, Find Yourself, 1990 to 2000. The 1990s were my decade in Vogue House. It was, if I'm honest, a decade that I had given little credence to before starting to write. I'd always had a nostalgic feeling that the 1960s were the fun years in fashion publishing. The decade when the most rules were broken and the best work was created. Now I think I was wrong, and I'm not alone. In 2022, an announcement for a documentary television series to be called In Vogue, the 1990s, stated that the 90s was such an exciting and important decade for fashion. It was the period when fashion entered the mainstream, and when it became inescapable, culturally relevant, and full of iconoclasm and expression and difference. The 1990s were the decade when Vogue House became fully populated, perhaps overpopulated, and when Vogue magazine found itself challenged for relevance and importance by 2 new titles within its own building. This challenge came not in a fashion sense, but instead for controversy and personality and for newspaper headlines. There is no doubt that the 90s was the decade when Vogue caught fire. Not literally, of course. There was even talk of the mailroom and loading bay being the centre of an illegal drug delivery service around London, and there were subsequent arrests. As this was the decade when everything was delivered to and from the building on the back of a motorbike or in a taxi. You heard stories from GQ and you heard stories from Tatler. You didn't really hear stories from Vogue. You definitely didn't hear stories from Brides or World of Interiors or House and Garden. The bad boys in the operation were GQ and Tatler. They were just naughty, remembers Sarah Miller, editor of Condé Nast Traveller magazine. Photographer Andrew McPherson has this memory. Vogue House was the hallowed temple of style, where everyone was in equal parts incredibly chic and absolutely terrifying. Going there as a photographer was like being summoned to the headmaster's study, filling my stomach with butterflies and the nervous desire to hustle out of there as quickly as possible. On each departure, I'd breathe a deep sigh of both gratitude at being summoned and relief at being back out in Hanover Square's leafy calm. Having ridden the wave of 1980s style, culture and fashion, magazines entered the new decade as important vehicles for communication. They had become political, intellectual, stylish arbiters of what was cool. The magazine you read said a lot about the type of person you wanted to be and maybe were. The 1990s was the decade of Cool Britannia, Tony Blair and the Spice Girls, Oasis and Blur, the YBAs, the Young British Artists, and lad culture. And in Vogue House, a decade of high-profile editors, controversy, elastic expense accounts and high salaries with associated perks for some. Meanwhile, entry into the building and access to working on the magazines was still as politically incorrect and as abstract as it had ever been. Jobs at Vogue House were never formally advertised. They were always discovered through word of mouth. To those outside Vogue House, the Condé Nasties could appear to be spoilt, privileged and overpaid. But for many, the lifestyle was just on loan, and it could be withdrawn just as quickly as it was offered. Stylish, busy people breezed through and disappeared into the building, and as you visited, you awaited your fate. As time went by, I got to know some of the reception committee who would say hello and ask how I was. On occasion, I would be told to go on up before a call was made. A sort of familiarity had been established, as if a test had been passed. Of course, the lifts were only the first hurdle. The inner doors on some levels were locked, and you could be stranded trying to catch someone's attention to actually get into a magazine. Another hazard that grew with time was seeing someone from another title from that which you were visiting. What were you working on? Of course you couldn't say, but how to not make it a faux pas? Working for the other side, whichever title rivalry was going on at the time, remembers photographer Simon Upton. The 1990s had something in common with the 60s, but I think that in reality Condé Nast was still stultified by royalty, hierarchy, status and tradition. They were the establishment wing of magazine publishing. I think in the 90s there was a much younger spirit, there was more adventure, there was a lot more boldness, remembers Sarah Miller. The UK version of GQ was launched in 1988, just 3 years before Esquire also launched its UK edition in 1991. With such a head start, GQ should have established itself as the premier men's magazine in the UK, but its launch had not gone well. The editor, Paul Kears, struggled to create an identity for the title that connected with an audience, and after just 1 year he was replaced. The launch issue had featured Tory grandee politician Michael Heseltine on the cover, as it attempted to distance itself from cool magazines such as The Face, which had a unisex appeal. The men's magazine Arena and the soft porn top shelf magazines such as Playboy and Mayfair. Stephen Quinn, publisher for the launch issue, admitted in Campaign in 1998 that I wasn't happy with Heseltine on the cover, but I could understand why he was there because we were playing it incredibly safe. Safe was not the right approach for the 90s. In 1990, a new editor was put in place who brought to the title considerable journalistic experience and Condé Nast pedigree. Alexandra Shulman was born in 1957, was the daughter of the newspaper critic Milton Shulman and the writer Drusilla Bayfus, who was a former contributor to Vogue and editor of Brides. Shulman began working as a fashion journalist at Tatler in 1982, under the editorship of Tina Brown and then Boxer. She subsequently went on to work at the Sunday Telegraph and Vogue before becoming editor of GQ. But once again, the editor's chair was only briefly filled at the men's magazine. When Liz Tilberis moved to New York, Shulman swiftly moved upstairs in the building to vacate her office and took on the editorship of Vogue. Shulman's replacement at GQ had been patiently waiting for his opportunity to edit the title, having been part of the original launch team. Michael Vermeulen was a larger-than-life figure in all senses, like a character from a Dashiell Hammett novel. Vermeulen was warm, informed, spirited, connected and confident, and completely out of place in the corridors of Vogue House. Born in Illinois, Vermeulen had a more literary background than other staff members on the men's magazines. Having come into contact during his late adolescence with the playwright David Mamet and the circle of actors surrounding him in Chicago at the Steppenwolf Theatre, including actor Willem Dafoe, Vermeulen brought an energy and intellectual confidence to the magazine, with an American sensibility that combined news-based features with articles on fashion, culture and leisure. Strong editorial content was complemented by confident photography and sophisticated design thanks to art director Paul Bowden, who had previously art directed Tatler when Michael Roberts was the creative director. Vermeulen and Bowden together helped to build British GQ into a viable publishing proposition. Eventually, Vermeulen's all-or-nothing approach to life caught up with him, and in 1995 he died of a drug overdose at his home in Islington. A coroner's inquest found that he had over 2.5 times the lethal dose of cocaine in his system, and concluded that his death was an unfortunate case of wild misadventure. In his obituary, Kennedy mused that, "I often felt that Vermeulen erected a cordon sanitaire around that dark room we all have within ourselves, wherein lay our vulnerabilities, our doubts. He indulged his enormous appetites. His weight skyrocketed. He had a cigarette permanently embedded between his teeth. He could drink just about everyone under the table. He kept on indulging." Along with many others, I attended his memorial service, at which a lone piper played, and actor Willem Dafoe remembered his friend. Photographer David Eustace gave us his memory. "My third commission for GQ was a cover story with the actor Robbie Coltrane. During the shoot, I made a portrait of Coltrane from the back, and I showed the finished prints to Michael Vermeulen in his office. He said that we should use the back portrait as the back cover, but it would never be agreed upstairs as the back cover generated too much income from advertisers. Then he offered me some wisdom that I've never forgotten. The front cover sells the magazine. The commissioned work inside sells the photographer. I like the bluntness and sharpness of Vermeulen, but I'm unsure how his creative wisdom would be treated today." James Brown was part of the 1990s Vogue House invasion of experienced magazine professionals who had been trained outside of Condé Nast and were successful elsewhere. The 1960s had seen the titles accept the working class as photographers and models, occasionally a journalist or stylist, but for many years the staff was still predominantly educated at private school or connected with the aristocracy. Now, the company was having to accept those from more diverse backgrounds into the building in lead positions in order to make its magazines commercially successful. Brown started at GQ in 1997 as editor and immediately brought to the title his high-energy lifestyle, partying, friends, and passion for magazines. He has since confessed that he had no interest in the title, but at Vogue House there are 460 employees, 50 of them men, many gay or ancient. The rest are great-looking posh girls. I was there at the time, in my early 30s, and I am heterosexual. So by Brown's maths, definitely in the minority. Brown's editorship was certainly a roller coaster ride. The atmosphere in the building at the time of his arrival was one of excitement, nervousness, and incredulity. Many adventures were had during Brown's short tenure, but as he has openly confessed, his life was unravelling due to excessive drink and drugs, and he is not the only member of his staff who has since been through rehab. Whilst all of this was happening on the first floor of the building, there were no less controversial adventures occurring on the third floor, where Tatler magazine was under the editorship of Jane Proctor. Her idea was to create a satirical hybrid magazine that recognised the rise of celebrity culture whilst retaining the magazine's traditional readership, concentrating on highbrow content with a mass-market approach and appeal. Hollywood celebrities featured on the cover, as did Princess Diana, which always guaranteed a high-selling issue as her relationship with the future king unravelled dramatically throughout the decade. Images by photographers such as Jane Bown, Richard Avedon, David Bailey, Don McCullen, Sylvia Platchey, David Eustace, William Klein, Abbas, Steve Pike, Jean-Luc CF and Corinne Day, amongst many other established and young photographers, graced its pages. Its dual personality is perhaps summed up in one infamous issue from 1998, in which the popular television personality Anthea Turner appeared on the cover, naked and wrapped in a live snake, whilst inside legendary photographer William Klein documented riots in Paris with graphic black and white images over 6 pages. In art directing the cover, I was inspired by the portrait of the German actress Nastasia Kinski, who was photographed naked wrapped in a snake by Richard Avedon, and the inclusion of Klein's photojournalism was my payoff response to the choice of Turner as cover star. It was a creative, exciting place to work, but not without its eccentricities amongst the staff, and dogs, in particular, remained a permanent fixture within the Tatler offices. Proctor was ambitious for the title and recognised the importance of compiling an editorial consultant team of talented and well-connected individuals, TTPs, or Tatler-type people, as they were referred to in the offices, to provide the latest society news, gossip, trends and issues of interest. Journalists employed by her on the editorial team included Giles Corran, A.A. Gill, Tamsin Day-Lewis, Emily McMeekan, Sarah Vine, Tina Godwin and future Secretary of State Michael Gove, as well as the novelists Wendy Holden, Harriet Lane and Kate Carco. Interns included television personalities Ben Fogle and Claudia Winkman, and Natalie Massenet, who would go on to launch Net-a-Porter, and Nails Inc. London founder Thea Callan was a fashion assistant. Many who worked at Tatler under Proctor went on to become magazine editors, including Samantha Scott Jeffries, Kate Reardon, Claire Gogarty, Melinda Stevens, Catherine Osler, Lucy Yeomans and Jeremy Langmead. All magazines should act as training grounds for future journalists and editors, but the sheer volume and quality of talent that came out of Tatler in the 1990s is particularly impressive and a testament to Proctor's editorship. The life of an intern on Tatler could launch someone with no prior experience in magazines into a media career, and two of perhaps the best-known examples are Claudia Winkman and Ben Fogle, who both started at Vogue House on the same day and have both gone on to be incredibly successful broadcasters. A third intern who started at the same time, Tobin Andre, brother of successful cartoonist Giles Andre, has also established a career from Tatler building blocks. He was placed into the features department and today is the head of communications and the spokesperson for HM King Charles III and Queen Camilla. Just as lad culture had become a phenomenon in the 1990s, so did the reimagined It Girl. Much has been written about the 90s It Girls, focusing on 4 well-connected Chelsea girls: Tara Palmer-Tompkinson, Normandy Keith, Tamara Beckwith and Lady Victoria Harvey. Many have claimed ownership of the moment that they were promoted as such, but the truth is slightly different to every version I have read. I know this because I came up with the concept in Jane Proctor's office. This is what happened and why. The photographer John Swannell had taken a series of photographs of Tara Palmer-Tompkinson, styled by her friend, the Tatler fashion director Kate Reardon. Although it was not unusual for the fashion director to style a shoot, the styling was always overseen by Proctor and commissioned by me. And on this occasion we knew nothing about these pictures. Budgets were tight, money had been spent, and so they had to be used. But they had come as a surprise, and we needed to come up with a reason for them to exist. We needed a story that explained why we had included them in the magazine. Jane and I closed her office doors and started to brainstorm, as we often did. I'd recently bought a copy of the photographer John D. Green's 1967 book, Birds of Britain, that featured portraits of young society women, including members of the 60s Chelsea set, some of whom were described as It Girls. I suggested that we should bring the It Girl back and that we could use Swanell's photographs to do so. I went to my desk and designed a layout with the headline, The It Girl. Showed it to Proctor, who approved, and the 1990s It Girl was born. You may hear other versions of this story, but this one is true. Vogue may have remained the elder statesman of the building, but that didn't stop it from creating its own controversies during the 1990s. With Alexandra Schulman's time as editor came a new approach to what the magazine should be. Robin Derrick, art director from 1994 to 2011, was a considerable factor in Schulman's Vogue, appearing so confident and graphically appealing. Born in 1962, Derrick attended Filton Technical College just outside Bristol and was first inspired by magazine photography when he walked into a lecture and found an October 1976 issue of Vogue with a cut glass logo and plain red cover, which had been art directed by Terry Jones and photographed by James Mortimer. Whilst a student, he began working at ID magazine with previous Vogue art director Terry Jones and at The Face with legendary art director Neville Brody, before going to Arena magazine with future GQ editor Dylan Jones. With such a pedigree, it is no surprise that his design of Vogue was both confident and informed. The addition of my former art department colleague at Elle, Jeff Waring, as design director in 1994, further strengthened the team. Just as punk had turned dark due to the deaths of Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen, so grunge found itself dragged towards a similar darkness with the suicide of Kurt Cobain. The two movements shared the growing use of heroin as a touch point. The hero of young photographers in the 1990s was the photographer Larry Clark, best known for his book Tulsa, that documented the drug life of his friends. Corinne Day's approach in the 1990s mirrored Clark's, anti-glamour and based on realistic documentation of a life lived. She made a series of images of Kate Moss for the 1993 issue of Vogue, for a story titled Underexposure. The photographs were based in the flat that Kate Moss and fellow photographers Glenn Luchford and Mario Sorrenti being Moss's boyfriend at the time, shared in Notting Hill. It was a typically scruffy rented flat, with cracked walls and mismatched furniture in the same London square as the apartment used for the 1970 film Performance, featuring Mick Jagger. Coincidentally, the first time I met Sorrenti was when he came to show me his portfolio whilst I was still at Elle. The portfolio contained photographs of his girlfriend naked in various parts of the same apartment, images that subsequently appeared in the book Kate in 1995. The clothes in Day's shoot looked thrown together, grabbed from whatever was lying on the floor, but were actually deliberately mismatched by stylist, fashion editor Kathy Castorine. Moss was beautiful but thin, for many too thin. The images were instantly seized upon for being inappropriate for a magazine such as Vogue to publish and labelled heroin chic. It was a fashion look born out of a reaction against the healthy and vibrant look of leading 1980s supermodels such as Cindy Crawford, Elle Macpherson and Claudia Schiffer. But pale skin, dark circles under the eyes, emaciated features and lank hair were all traits associated with heroin abuse. Day and the team seemed to many as if they didn't care that this was controversial, and therefore were not paying Vogue the respect that many believed it was due. I had to handle an overwhelming number of irate phone calls from mothers complaining and questioning why this skinny new model was portrayed so extensively throughout the magazine. Comments were made such as, "She looks anorexic and like a drug addict," or "Surely this is not the message we want to give to our daughters." It was part of the controversy that arose during the early days of Kate Moss's modelling career, referring in particular to a set of images in which she is shown in underwear with fairy lights decorating a bedroom with an unmade bed. Her images were a marked difference to the retouched and enhanced images we had become used to featuring. Kate's hair was unmade. It seemed as though she had just woken up, her expression a bit blank, and she slouched, unusual in the super-stylized Vogue. It provoked astonishment and a reaction amongst many Vogue aficionados. It was the beginning of a new era of fashion photography, and I was there to witness it, right at the forefront, ensconced at Condé Nast, in Vogue House, remembers intern at the time and now photographer Julia Fullerton Batten. Schumann was accused of propagating the heroin chic look, whilst contributing to a national increase in eating disorders and promoting unrealistic expectations for women. A new decade and a new century would present the publishing industry, including those within Vogue House, with changes outside of their control. How they would respond to the challenges of a new millennium would affect the very existence of many magazines and the employment of their staffs. It would also see budgets for photographers plummet. It would not be an exaggeration to say that working in Vogue House would never be the same again. I hope you've enjoyed the last 4 weeks, 4 episodes of something a little bit different for the Photographic Life podcast. I think it's important to understand that as photographers, our photography exists within context. And in the past, the most prevalent of those contexts was the newspaper or the magazine. Therefore, I think it's really important to be informed and interested in that context, as much as you may be in the making of photography. Anyway, you may agree with me, you may not, but that's the basis of this podcast. Next week, we're back to the old ways as we get into the autumn. We'll be wrapping up a little bit warmer and welcoming back Bill Shapiro and Fiona Hayes for their regular contributions. And of course, as things do start to move towards the end of the year, we'll be taking care.